Welcome back to this week's OIS podcast. Today, our host, Dr. Paul Karpecki, sits down with legendary inventor, innovator, and optometrist Donald Korb. It's a fascinating discussion you'll want to listen to all the way through. Take it away, Dr. Karpecki.
Hello and welcome to the OIS podcast. I'm Paul Karpecki. I practice in Lexington, Kentucky, and today I have a great pleasure to interview Dr. Donald Korb. Donald Korb in optometric profession is truly, if not, in my opinion, the most innovative practitioner I have ever met. He's always been decades ahead. He's termed key things that we take for granted today, like Meibomian Gland Dysfunction, MGD, and go through so much in the world of contact lenses prior and now lid seal today, all came from Donald Korb. Donald had this great ability to observe and apply it to research and make it practical and was willing to share things. If it wasn't for Donald, my dry eye clinic wouldn't be where it's at today. He was kind enough to open up his doors to me numerous times, and I'd go in for refresher courses at his office, and I'd pick up new things, whether it was Demodex 15 or 17 years ago, or whether it was MGD, during that time of understanding it more as just coming out with diagnostics. So I'm grateful to Donald for where it's at, but I also think he's the perfect person to interview from an innovative standpoint because he's a humble man. And so although we know him well in optometry, I think across the field, he's well known in ophthalmology. We now have the chance to really get to know him and to utilize his skill of seeing the future. He always seemed to anticipate where things are going, whether it was contact lenses, dry eye, MGD, et cetera. So I'm honored to have you here, Donald. Thank you for making the time to join the OIS podcast.
It's my pleasure, Paul. Thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to talking with you and having some fun.
Thank you. Me too. How did you end up in optometry?
When I was in college, I realized that I really didn't want to be a physician. And I didn't like blood. I didn't like a lot of the aspects of medicine at that time. Today, it wouldn't bother me, but then it did. So it was a crazy time. It was between the wars and it was just a very turbulent time in a different way than today, but turbulent nevertheless. And my father practiced, and he had a large suite of 4 or 5 rooms, and there was an adjacent suite that attached to it, sort of. And there was an optometrist there. And my father became very friendly with the optometrist over the years. And my mother always heard his grinding lenses. And she thought, my goodness, he must be very busy. This is a wonderful profession to be in. It's much better than medicine. He just sees a few people, nice and clean, et cetera, et cetera. And, but she didn't know is that he wasn't doing well enough to get a modern machine that would turn out lenses quickly. So at any rate, between that and between my mother and between the turbulent times and between the fact that certain aspects of optometry, when I looked into it, attracted me, because you did have a chance to work with people, and it was pretty well, as you know, in those days, Paul, more mathematics and physics than it was biological. Although I was very fortunate because the school I went to was giving courses in immunology when actually Harvard Medical School wasn't teaching immunology. It wasn't a great course, but it was a 1-hour course for 1 semester. And we were really on a medical model, because the person who really ran the school was a refugee from Austria named Otto Hochstadt, who really was determined that optometry would grow and optometry would become a medical discipline. So that's why I went to optometry school.
That's great. So then you obviously had research. You played a key role in industry. You were a developer of one of the top contact lenses that eventually was bought out. You invented the LipiFlow, the LipiView, but played a key role in central corneal clouding understanding around contact lenses early on. How did the move get into those areas? This was just intrigue for you? Was research just something that seemed appealing? Did someone kind of mentor you in that direction? What led you down a path that was truly very different at that time for the average optometrist?
Well, like most things that happened by accident. And the first accident was that in school, in our senior year, we had an actual course in contact lenses taught by a man named Frederick Farnham. And he was the first person in New England to ever fit a contact lens. And he was rather well known, grumpy, but really did teach a reasonably good course. We didn't have any clinic associated with it. It was just a didactic course. But he was very diligent in teaching us. And, that was exciting to me. That was really exciting to me because it just brought out a whole different area. And then when I graduated, I went into practice with a doctor who, by accident, was in the same building as Dr. Farnham. There was actually 40 optometrists in the building that I went to when I started practice, in that one large building, and probably 150 dentists. Well, the practice that I went into, although primarily worked in various forms of visual training and orthoptics in those days, although it worked in that area, what was so interesting is that he also fitted contact lenses. And he really didn't like it. So that sort of fell over into me, and I knew nothing about it. So that drove me with the passion to learn quickly about contact lenses. And the successes that he had were just so dramatic that I really became passionate. And that led me into thinking. And before you know, I had managed to come up with a plan for topography. I conceived that the way we were doing it was wrong. It should all be done by profiles, because the eye really isn't, the eye from an evolutionary point is still looking out. And that's why we have a positive angle kappa. So you have a profile. So the nasal limbus is pushed forward and the temporal limbus is pushed back because the eyes are really, really directed out. So I thought, well, how am I going to do that? Well, profile photography. So Polaroid Corporation was ruling the world, and they were just across the river from me in Cambridge. So I managed to get over there. I started chatting with people. And before you know it, I had a research grant. And a little while later, I was director of ocular photography and dentistry, which was a big item. With that, and I really didn't know a thing. I think I was probably 25 or 26 years of age. But anyway, then I started doing that research. And the passion that I had for that was rewarded by the fact that my professor, Dr. Farnham, decided to retire. And although he didn't like me now because I had been in his building and I was fitting contact lenses, and he was egotistical and sensitive about that, he invited me up and he invited me to succeed him. Well, he had a large practice. So all of a sudden, I was about 3 years out of school. And I was seeing 20 contact lens patients a day. Plus, I had the Polaroid research behind me. And somehow or another, Dr. Farnham used to determine whether lenses were fitting well by whether or not they steepened the cornea. And I thought there must be a better way. And all of a sudden, my work at Polaroid came back to haunt me, and because I used it to develop sclerotic scatter. And that was my first love, because with that technique, I could actually see. I could see very clearly what I termed central corneal clouding, what I named central corneal clouding. So anybody with the slit lamp could now see edema caused by a contact lens. Bingo! So that led very quickly to gas permeable lenses, and on and on and on. And once I had central corneal clouding behind me, I was off. Because I had a reputation, I was written up in many places, and my practice just grew, and I had more funds and more research, and that's how it started, Paul.
That's great. That's an accomplishment to be proud of it, because it changed a lot of how we looked at things with contact lenses. You've also named 8 ocular conditions, that including Meibomian Gland Dysfunction, MGD, which everybody utilizes as common involved in that, lid wiper epitheliopathy, lid seal, which I think is critical to the future. It's critical now, but I think we're going to really start to understand, because I have so many patients that I see per day where that's the pathology. That's been causing all the problems. They just don't seal. And having, your testing with Dr. Blackie, the KB test, all those kind of interventions along the way, lid wiper epitheliopathy. What are you most proud of, or does it all kind of run together?
Yeah, well, it all kinds of runs together, and it's like a big dream. James Thurber wrote The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, which most people now don't know, but when I went to high school, that was compulsory to read, and it was about dreams, about how Walter Mitty, this fictional character, would dream about where he wanted to be. So I was just living that dream all the time. It's almost like whatever I observed in the clinic in a relatively short period of time came to reality. What am I most proud of? Well, Paul, I'd say that my first love, there's always a first love, and that was central corneal clouding. And putting together how to see that was just good fortune because of all my prior experiences I've just explained. It was, your first love is your first love in life. And usually, whether it's successful or not, we won't go into that. But at any rate, your first love is your first love. So central corneal clouding was really my first love. Now, the most exciting thing that I ever did, can you guess it?
It's got to be in the dry eye world, the Meibomian Gland Dysfunction. For me, and that's unbiased because for me, that has such an impact in everything we do every day. It's the most common diagnosis we're going to see. So maybe I'm leading it because of, my background in terms of how much it's helped me. I'd have to think it's in that category, whether it's measurements or diagnostics or treatments.
Well, you're absolutely right. If we think of medical optometry. But absolutely the most exciting thing that I ever did was before we had the present emphasis on medical optometry. And that was when I developed the first membrane contact lens. And I had this dream sitting in a lecture, listening to Norman Beer in England. And he was pontificating about many things. He was the first person, by the way, Paul, to ever fenestrate a scleral lens, Norman Beer. Yeah. And so I'm sitting in a relatively small audience of invited people, maybe 30 people, who were invited to his prime lecture, honor lecture. And I'm sitting there and I'm saying, he's talking about pushing the eye out. What we need is what the rabbit has. We need a nictitating membrane. We need a visual device which mimics the nictitating membrane. It's got to be really thin. It should be as thin as the epithelium. It should be 3 or 4 cells thick. So I embarked in that. And all of a sudden, when it was so difficult to fit a soft contact lens, when they caused all sorts of troubles, you could take a CSI lens that was 30, 40 microns thick. You could put it on an eye, Paul. Person wouldn't feel it. They'd just look around. Huh? When are you going to put? Oh, but I can see. They couldn't feel it. It was fantastic. And then they could wear it for 30 days and never take it off. And the lens wouldn't fog usually. I mean, it was just miraculous, By the way, that lens was never produced the way the prototypes were, the way the studies were done. They could never make the polymer in adequate quantity. So that was just so exciting. And then seeing it and seeing how it just changed the whole field. That was probably the most exciting thing that I've ever done and that I'm most proud of. But the most intellectually satisfying and pragmatically, something that will last forever is what you have said, Meibomian glands. And working with Tony Henriques on this, who was a pathologist, an ophthalmologist, a pathologist, a PhD in glandular function. He had all these credentials, and he was in Boston. And to this day, we're very close friends. We speak at least once a month. With Tony, we just worked that out. And that was certainly the most intellectually satisfying. Because when you discovered it, you really don't know what you really discovered, because it has to get out to everybody before you really know the magnitude of what you've done. But when I discovered it, I was confident that that was the major cause of dry eye. And in fact, in the original article, which we published, Paul, we told the treatment. We told that the treatment was expression of the glands to remove the obstruction, and that the treatment was warm compresses to heat and open up the glands. So I think that those are probably the most exciting and the things that I am more proud of. But I should point out that when you take lid wiper epitheliopathy, and you take all of these things, Meibomian gland dysfunction, lid seal, they have one thing in common. Now, if I mentioned to you edematous corneal formations, have you ever heard of that?
No.
No. Well, I named that, and that's the name that I coined. And when you had edema with rigid contact lenses, you got these little crazy linear formations, and they formed at the basement membrane, because it was wrinkling of the basement membrane caused by the edema. And I named that condition. It's gone. It doesn't exist. I mean, somebody as knowledgeable as you has never heard of it. And why should you? Because you don't fit rigid contact lenses. And sclerals don't do it the same way. Sclerals have a different action. So if you take everything that you've mentioned, and are my favorites, in GPC, for instance, is another one. You take all these things. They were not contact lens induced. They're due to other reasons, and they will be here long after we're gone. And Meibomian gland dysfunction will be here forever. Little white epitheliopathy will be here forever, on and on and on. So I think it's very, very important to distinguish what makes something really, 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 really important. And I think that is that it has universal and long-lasting value. That it's just not an invention or a development until there's a better development. It's something that students will be taught for generations. So I don't know whether that explains it, Paul, but hopefully
it really does. That was terrific. And, thinking of it, you discovered essentially the soft contact lens we all use today. You discovered the type of dry eye, the type of contributor to 86% of all dry eye, technically, or even 90%, has this element in it. So it's the most common form of dry eye, plus all the other forms. What were the skills or insights that you either had or learned along the way that contributed to observing or to picking up on things like this that are of such significant impact to our industry, to our field?
Most people credit me with being a good observer, and I probably am. But I take the time to observe. I love to observe. It brings me great pleasure. It's an intellectual process. And if you ask, well, what is intellectual? Well, the basic definition of an intellectual is really someone or an intellectual activity where a process of examination is going on, not for the object of the knowledge that it brings, but for the process itself. So an intellectual just examines anything for the sake of examining it. And I've been fortunate to try to temper that tendency that I have, and instead try to be pragmatic about it. So in order to have your observations mean anything, the first point about them is that it takes time. And the second point about it is you have to ask a question: why? Why do we see this? And once you ask the question why, and if you're persistent, and persistent is very important, you'll ultimately come up with the answer. So I would say that would be the first insight that I would have. And the second one would be your ego. You really, really have to sublimate your ego. And why do you have to sublimate your ego? Because it gets you nowhere. I mean, you and I are not what we are because we created ourselves. We were created differently, depending on how you believe in creation. But it took a man and a woman to make Paul Karpecki or Donald Korb. And we didn't control that process. It was the random good luck if you come out well. It's random poor luck if you don't come out as well. So with present knowledge, we can't take credit for being an intellect. But what we can do is we can learn to sort of understand that and temper our ego. And because from a pragmatic point of view, and not a philosophical view, but just a pragmatic point of view, what do we have to do? We have to collaborate with people. There are no more Leonardo da Vinci's. And why are there no more Leonardo da Vinci's? Because Leonardo da Vinci himself could not master ocular care. I mean, it's just too big. I mean, there's just too many areas. I mean, you or I cannot specialize in 25 different areas. We can't be a neuro person. We can't be this. We can't be that. Yeah, we can know enough to refer. We can be aware of it, but we certainly can't be an expert in all of these areas. So our base of knowledge basically says that there'll be no more Leonardo da Vinci's, that we have to collaborate. And we really, really, really just have to sublimate our ego and be able to work in a team. And I don't know whether I ever shared with you the old story with Bertrand Russell and his impact on society. Did I share that with you?
I remember you mentioning his name, but I'd love to hear the insight, or have the listeners hear the insight.
Yeah, well, basically, he wrote a book, The Impact of Science and Society, and published it in 1951. And of course, what that book's, the most important point out of that book is that as we move forward with technology and knowledge, the impact it will have in society is just what's happened. It will be more and more important in the first stage to have the knowledge, but in the second stage, to be the manager of that knowledge, that you won't be able to do it yourself. He didn't say Leonardo da Vinci, but that's what he was really saying, that you won't be able yourself to do it because you need to put together teams. So the people who can put together the team, the person who can collaborate, the person who can do all that, that's the person who will make the maximum contribution. So I think that collaboration is just so very, very important, but you can't collaborate if you can, but collaboration is greatly improved, aided, supported by having a great relationship with everything and respecting everybody and not being an egomaniac, as unfortunately many people are. Now, it's very, very difficult that what I said when I say, okay, well, what was my first love? What am I most proud of? Well, people would say, well, that's egotistical. He's bragging. He's done these things. But that's reporting. And it's very, very difficult. Just like I was taught by a great philosopher at Berkeley, actually, that the most difficult thing in life is to tell somebody you like them or you love them or you have a great affinity for them. And the reason is because it's a barrier, because people will wonder, why is the person doing that? So it's a matter of communication. So it's difficult, but the better the relationship you have in any collaboration, the faster the project will go. And everybody knows that by default, but they don't know it by design. And I was fortunate enough when I was a young person, I was probably in my 30s when it all dawned on me, and I had read Bertrand Russell earlier, but I put it all together. And that's the way I think. So that's why I share, because that's what we should do.
That's great. So what are you working on today? Where are you putting your energies into? Are you able to share kind of where your focus is at? Is it tagging on to some of these great accomplishments already? Is it something kind of new? Is it an extension? Where's your energy being put in today, Donald?
In order to answer that question, and I will answer it, we have to go back and think what's wrong with our thinking. So if I were to ask you, and I have a great respect for you because you're a great clinician and you have all this knowledge from all the people and companies you work with,
thank you.
Which is a tremendous advantage because you've seen successes, you've seen failures, you've seen mediocre things. And I'm sure you know that if you work with 10 companies or 10 companies working very, very hard, if one out of the 10 produces a relatively useful clinical product, everybody's happy, or the investors are happy, because it's not so easy to produce something that really works. So what I would like to do is just go back for a moment and say, what are the classical, there's two words we have to understand, Paul, categorization. And we also have to understand in the broader picture, with categorization, we really have to understand the conceptualization that goes with it. So we have categorization and we have conceptualization. So if we just talk about the categorization, and I were to say, help me understand treatment. What is our goal? How should we think when we want to treat somebody? Okay. Were you ever taught that in a course?
Not specifically. I think
not specifically, right? No, not specifically. And all that has been lost. And it's basic in the scientific literature of 50 years ago. So without pontificating, I'll just name them quickly. The first point is curative. We all want to cure people. So it's curative. And curative and restoration, they're a little bit different, but maybe restoration is a subgroup under the original curative. So we basically have curative, and then we can add restorative. And what else do we want to do when we are involved with treatment? Well, it's generally agreed in the classics that palliative, We have to provide comfort for people. We have to provide comfort for people. And what's the third? Prevention. So the three aspects of treatment by design should be curative or restorative, preventative, and palliative. Now, you and I do that by default, not by design.
Correct.
And whenever you do anything by default and not by design, it can never be as good as when you design it. So before lid seal, people came in and you said, well, use an ointment. And, a lot of people came back and said, doctor, that ointment worked great. But a lot of people came back and said the ointment doesn't work great. So by default, your method of practice can never be as good as it is by design. You want to comment on that, Paul? Because that's the basis of what I'm doing, and it's important. So what do you think of that as a concept?
I love the concept. I've never intellectually looked at it so specifically. I've just that is what we're doing. And when we have success, we do need all three elements. Because if you just, worked on curative, but it returned, that didn't help. If you worked on something that was a cure, but it wasn't comfortable for the patient, they're not going to continue to use it. And if you tried to do the first two, but you didn't allow it, you allowed it to come back, you're really where you started again. So the three are brilliant in terms of really what we try to do with every disease state we're trying to manage.
Now you can Google treatment, how to treat, and maybe 1 out of 15 will have that model. Okay, but it isn't taught. It just isn't taught. Okay. Now, in addition to that, Paul, there are many treatments. And the treatments are subdivisions of other treatments, or they're mixtures. So someone might say, well, tell me about immune dry eye. Well, what do you want me to tell you about it? How do we want to treat it? Okay. Where does that fit into the entire thing? Is really dry eye caused by immune diseases? Or do the immune diseases cause something else which causes the dry eye? So do the immune diseases attack the Meibomian glands and the lacrimal gland maybe? And then you have problems. But you have to be clear in our thinking about what we're doing. And I listen to people and I just say, my goodness gracious, it's a miracle people ever get well, because they're being treated by default. They're not being treated by design. And I don't expect every doctor or ophthalmologist or optometrist to go through a lengthy process. And as you have taught me and others have taught me, you can actually be very, very exacting in a diagnosis and get all this information, but you can also, with just your thumb, determine does somebody have MGD, and does that really change the treatment? Well, it makes it more by default rather than by design, but it's still pretty good. So there's all these things that we can do. So now let's go back. So now what we want to do is, what would the optimal treatment be, Paul? The optimal treatment, and stop me and correct me if anything isn't clear. The optimal treatment would be one where we address all three of those areas, and we try to restore the Meibomian glands as much as we can. If we can, and of course, it's nice to have meibography so you can see what you've lost. So that's just so critical. So we need all those in one. We need to treat everybody with that, with all of those. We have to have all those multiple treatments. We have to stop evaporation from the eye. We have to worry about the lid wiper. We have to worry about lid seal. We have to have something which addresses all of those things. Okay, all of those things. We have to make it simple. We have to apply it where anybody can apply it to their eye. It isn't a big complicated thing to apply. It isn't dangerous, et cetera, et cetera. And that maybe it has a maximum application of twice a day or something like that. You set your limits, and now you go ahead and then you design that optimal treatment. So you've got to use all the categories, Paul. All of the categories have to be in there, and you still need a diagnosis. The diagnosis is different, but you have to know that you have dry eye, quotes, whatever dry eye is, and dry eye is a rubric for all things. But the name is never going to change, and everybody understands it. So that's all that matters. So what I've been doing is I've been working on developing a product that people can use that will be able to do that and do it efficiently. And I find that very exciting. Now, that may be the most, if it works and if I'm successful, that may be the most exciting thing that I've ever done. So it's sort of a big round and round and round story, but hopefully I answered your question.
You did, and it's a great culmination of all this research, incredible number of publications, all that they've done, and putting it all together now in those three key elements. But based on all of your work over decades, to solve something that is significant if you think about the population. So last question. One of the things I've always admired about you is your ability to kind of look to the future. And maybe it's that you're just a great observer, and because of that, you are picking up on things in a good way that then becomes the mainstay, whether it was the first, contact lens, soft contact lens that was comfortable that came out, whether it was Meibography, whether it was MGD, all these things. In fact, I think back in 2011, you had coined, we asked a question like this. You said the dental model would be, something that just makes sense for eye care, where you come in and you have the procedures done. And then you also have something where you maintain it, kind of like going to see your dentist, having a deep cleaning and then brushing and flossing. Do you still see that as the future for certain parts of eye care, like dry eye disease, or what are you looking to down the road now for where we might be going?
If you look at the dental model, Paul, it meets the treatment model of three, the palliative, the curative and the prevention. They are successful because they meet that model, and we don't. And until we do, we're never going to be totally effective. Boy, it's great to have this opportunity to chat with you, because I could never get this published, in a good journal. No matter how much I paid for it, I could never get it published.
That's correct.
So, but the dentist is just so far ahead of us in that, yes, the dental model is going to take over. We'll have better and better products. But no matter what we do, no matter how good the products are, there will always be the need for you and I in a clinic room, because we will have to determine of those three which need the most attention, what preventive methods should be applied, because there'll be a multitude of them. There'll be multiple treatments. There'll be all these different treatments, and that's what we have to do. So I think the future will be in that. I think the future will be in the dental model for professionals. And I think that ultimately it may even go into commercial optometry, because it gets simpler and simpler. It will be easier to implement part of the dental model in 30 seconds. And the quicker interestingly, the purpose of a profession, as taught in the Flexner report many, many years ago when medicine became medicine, the purpose of the profession is to develop things and take them from an art, make the science so strong that those areas can become technical acts. So our own purpose, your purpose and my purpose, is to obsolete ourselves and make our sphere of influence smaller and smaller, where we need it less and less and less and less. But there's always more and more. Somehow or another, we haven't reached that point yet. So I think that's where we're going, Paul.
This was excellent, Donald. What a wonderful interview. Thank you for sharing so much, so many insights, so many key pearls that can help people who are looking to do something similar, or a new way to look at things that they haven't before. And yes, pointing out, reporting the accomplishments is certainly not bragging. These are things that have changed how we all practice today, and we're all grateful for that. We would not have the industry we had today if it wasn't for Donald Korb. And so that's still being extremely modest, as you always are, and humble. But it was wonderful for you to take your time today to share with everybody. Wonderful to hear about, really getting to know you even better. I feel I've known you for many years, and you've been so instrumental in so many of our practices and how we in optometry and ophthalmology practice today. But getting to know you at this level was a real treat, and thank you for doing so.
I really appreciate the opportunity, and it was fun. I think I take home from it the fact that you provided me with a platform where I could say what I wanted to say, And the fact that you know so much about these areas allowed you to understand what was important and what wasn't important, and have an open mind and listen to it, and know from my past record that it is just an extension. What you said, that it's an extension of everything. That's exactly what it is. And without that long background, I couldn't think this way. So thank you very much, Paul, for that opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Donald. It's my pleasure, and I want to thank OIS for providing this opportunity, and thank all of you for listening today.
Thank you for listening, everyone. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the OIS podcast. Be sure to subscribe to our iTunes channel so you get the latest ophthalmology insights. Got a story of your own to tell? Apply to be a guest at OIS.net.